Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Welcome to, this is about episode 51 of Quarantine. And we're entering this wonderful season where we're talking about infrastructure and the future. And today we're going to go deep into that. And here's Mickey. Hey, Mick. Oh, I brought up your whiteboard. And there's you.
Yeah. Hey, Peter, there's a time delay so that I'm actually hearing you twice. And I'm just worried. I'm worried that.
All right. Well, why don't you do the introduction and I'll take me off and maybe you'll only hear us once. Hi, do you hear me twice?
Not now.
Is this okay?
Yeah, this is okay.
Welcome back to Quarantine after that disruption in the space-time continuum. Mickey,
oh no, it's still there. It's just time delayed. I think you have something in Quarantine. I think you've got some synchronization thing going on, Peter, with your audio.
Here's what I'd like to suggest. Why don't I take me off, you start the show, and I'll go work on me.
Okay. Okay, maybe I was the only one hearing the audio. Hi, everybody. My name is Mickey. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, and then I think Peter will come on back on. It might have been me, Peter, so come back. We love you. I think there was some extra web page open. Today's episode is actually kind of fun. We're going to be talking about fun and scary at the same time. We're going to be talking about infrastructure. That doesn't sound that fun to some people, but to other people, it does. There are people who spend their whole lives building, designing, building, maintaining, managing infrastructure, and also dealing with the policies and the codes and all the things that have to do with infrastructure. And there's something happening right now with infrastructure in that, typically, if we go all the way back to London in the 1600s, famously, there was a horrible cholera epidemic. And it was because this ancient medieval town had kind of grown and grown and grown, and there were so many people that there was a lot of sewage, and the sewage just sort of didn't have anywhere to go because we hadn't invented kind of maybe the right way to handle the sewage. And an epidemic broke out of cholera, and people were just dying in droves. And there's a famous book about this called Ghost Map, which is that the citizen scientist that actually figured it out started drawing Christian crosses everywhere people died. He was trying to do basically like a what's killing them. And at the time in the 1600s, they thought it might be that people died because they had low moral values, or because of the miasma, because it was pretty smoky there. Or it might have just been that they just weren't great citizens and they died. Or maybe it was just, God's wrath, and we don't know why they're dying. But as he was drawing those Christian crosses, he discovered that there was a brewery where a lot of the people who worked in this neighborhood where the brewery was were kind of paid in beer. And that's a pretty good bargain. And nobody was dying that actually worked at the brewery, but everybody in that same neighborhood and other neighborhoods were dying. And he came up with a thesis that because they were being paid in beer, they were drinking beer and they weren't drinking from the well. And the well, maybe it had something going on. And so he snuck out one night after trying to get the mayor, and he tried to get everybody else to actually do something about it for months. He snuck out at night with a wrench and just took the handle off the well that was in this area that kind of it was actually one of the first data visualizations ever recorded in terms of this kind of epidemiological data visualization. Took the lever off the well, and suddenly people stopped dying of the cholera epidemic. Now, this was before we understood that these really small things called animalcules at the time, bacteria today, might be seeping into the well. And so it actually led to wastewater treatment. It led to sewage systems. It led to us being able to sort of create a new kind of organism. You know, we have the bacteria were affecting us, but we also had a new organism that was the city itself. And so over time, we've evolved a collection of policies and practices, best practices, code, building code, plumbing code, electrical code, that are kind of like the Bible of how to do things. Like, don't ever put a faucet below the level of a sink. If you're a plumber, there's no plumber on the planet that would put a faucet below the level of the sink. And the reason is that someone probably died, probably a whole town died, because when the faucet's below the sink and wastewater can kind of pour up over the sink, the faucet sumps the water, the dirty water, back into the well and poisons the well. So everybody knows, like, this is the way you do it. This infrastructure is really important. You're putting complexity in the world, and we have to protect citizens. So that's evolved over a community of practice for decades, sometimes centuries. But now we've got new infrastructure that's kind of waking up. It's got Internet of Things. It's got sensors so it can detect what's happening. It's collecting to some kind of cloud. I don't know who's controlling that cloud. It's got machine learning. It might be making decisions about like what you did moving through this infrastructure of a city or a town or a community. And now with the rise of robotic automation, it might even change itself or try to change you. And so that's the topic that we're going to talk about today. And we're super excited to have two guests with us today. Peter, can we bring on Alec and Beth? Let's see. Peter, are you there?
Let's do that. And am I still sounding double, or have I reduced myself to a single voice?
Single voice. Beth?
Hello,
Alec,
can you see me?
say something.
Well,
Hello.
I am definitely on.
Hi, Peter. Hi, Mick.
How you doing?
Good.
Are you time delayed, Beth or Alec? Are you hearing me and you're responding immediately? I just want to make sure that
Sounds
we're all
good.
working producer-wise. You're good? You're good?
Sounds good.
Yes, and I separately put up an air monitor and listen to us on the internet, and we're sounding fabulous on the internet.
We're much bigger on the internet than we are in real life. I'm only 7 inches tall. Okay, so here's the thing. Alec and Beth, I want first, I'm just so happy you're both here. You're both my friends. I've worked with you in the past. Alec, we worked together for quite a while. You were one of my first sort of sponsors and internal thinkers at Autodesk, who had sort of embraced me when I was new as a fellow and really helped me think about some of the tricky issues about how to pull apart all this complex stuff and really start to see the information architecture hidden behind it and start to think about the privacy and the trust and all the other kinds of issues that might be involved. So I'm super excited that you're here, and you've got an amazing project that's still underway that we're going to be having today. And Beth, you know, you've been doing some amazing work. You published a book. You're up at University of Toronto, and you're doing some work around sort of society and design and creativity and trust. So I'm excited to have you here too. I think what we're going to do is, Beth, if you could just do a bit of an intro, because I don't do a very good job of it, for yourself. And then we're going to push you back into the green room, and then we're going to have Alec do a little bit of an explanation of the project, and then we'll have you come on back out. We'll just have a dinner table conversation.
Okay, cool.
That's first, yeah.
Okay, so I run the Cities Platform Lab at the University of Toronto, and it started as thinking about smart cities and civic engagement. And then Sidewalk Labs showed up, and COVID showed up, and all kinds of things started to emerge. So there are even more things to think about. The big problems haven't gone away, but what we're seeing is kind of the sidewalk crack open with opportunity, because in some ways we're much more on the same page about we're seeing some of the same problems together, which is important. And also things like co-design things like space for thinking. Nick did give a talk to my undergrad class, so I was coached on that. So really, what I've been working on is IoT in public space, and also more recently, AI as speculative as opposed to predictive. And I can talk about why I'm tagging it in those ways. But in both cases, one of the things that's important is how do we move toward consent and trust and knowing and participation and not just extraction. So that's my intro.
And Beth, it sounds like in that period of time that Toronto moved through sidewalk, and you all then almost had a collective experience of understanding what is this beast of a city with IoT and automation, that suddenly there's a sense of what this next thing is and people can collaborate and work on it, which is be really interesting to get into that, right? That is a literacy change across the city. That's pretty exciting.
Yes, and we can do some trash talking, but mostly what we want to do is solve problems.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I think you just pointed out something that I hadn't really thought about. That and maybe I thought about it in a different way, but I didn't really think about it in the framing you had, which is this worldwide pandemic has brought a lot of things into focus that maybe weren't in focus before, or that were easy to dismiss. And now everyone actually is almost synchronized and more sensitive to even our world, our spaces, our offices, what we can walk, where we can't, what we can do. So I think this feels very powerful, and I hadn't really thought of it that way. So we'll get into that as well. So we're gonna have you jump back into the green room, and then Alec, and we'll bring you back in a bit. Alec, a little bit of an introduction, and feel free. There's down at the bottom. There's the ability to share your screen, and you can just pull up a PowerPoint or whatever, and be able to. And Peter will pull it on if you feel like showing stuff. But go ahead and just give us a 10 or 15 minutes, however much you want, of sort of what the heck are you working on? Who are you?
Yeah, sure. So let me just say that you're the person who got me into this in the first place, right? The reason I was so eager to embrace you is that I'd read Trillions. I had this interest.
Well, you're blaming me, and I'm blaming you. I like this. Okay, it's mutually assured.
And in fact, this project that we first worked on, which the Primordial project, which turned into HackRod, that was my first sort of major foray into this area. And the MX3D bridge, the fact that I went and suggested that very cool bridge, which I will show you in just a second, that we try to make it a smart bridge, that came directly out of the desire to do more than we were already doing with the HackRod project.
And for folks that have never heard about who I am, my name is Mickey, and that thing right over there is this book I wrote, my first book called Trillions, which I put up today because we're actually going to be talking about some of the topics I think that we tried to address there, and I try. I'm shameless with self-promotion, but I try not to normally have it like over my shoulder. But I think that's about the rise of trillions of computational things that now are starting to wake up, and the question is, what do we do?
Yeah, what's that like? So I've actually ended up doing a project that's almost at the polar opposite of that, which is that you talk about what happens when everything's awake and has some degree of sensibility. And what we've done in Amsterdam with the MX3D bridge is we've made one thing come awake, which has a really quite incredible array of sensors and capabilities. So let me try and give this share a chance.
Give it a try.
What works here, selecting, does it come up easily? This one should be it. All right. So this is all pictures. No, should be pretty much no text. Let me know when that's.
And then Peter, you just have to bring that up.
There it is.
Yeah, there it is.
Right.
Is a way to get it to show the full screen?
Yeah, God knows.
Let me try to share. Maybe the full screen is the right way to do it.
Oh yeah, that was here. I'm gonna go back.
Well, let's see. Maybe Alec can do it. I think it's on Alex's side.
Maybe.
I think what you want to do is go into presenter mode.
All right. So let's see how well this works. How's that?
Perfect.
All right. Great. So that's a shot of the MX3D printer. And you look at it and it looks so strange, not just because you're standing next to it or it's sitting in a workshop, but it is really a strange beast. It's built by robots wielding MIG welders at the end of their arms, automobile construction, industrial robots. And it's basically built up of millions and millions of individual welds in what is in effect 3D printing.
So before you go on, I just want to flag, I can see the little thing that says stop sharing right kind of in the middle of the picture, and you might just have to drag that down a little lower or something. There you go. Perfect.
Great.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, this is kind of crazy. That bridge was woven by some crazy kind of a robot. And it's got this old new, it looks almost like the old subways from the turn of the century or from earlier times, and yet new. All right, keep going. I don't want to keep interrupting.
Yeah, and the nice thing about this, so it's the bridge itself is this totally unique structure. It's not bilaterally symmetrical. It's when you work metal in this stainless steel in this way, I mean, you get all sorts of new material properties. It's really a bleeding edge piece of infrastructure, and the idea is that it will be placed. You can see it here in the background. I hope you can see my pointer. It'll be placed over a canal right in the middle of the Amsterdam city center. So it's kind of the newest thing going in the middle of the oldest thing. So I came along in 2016, and I said to MX3D, hey, radical new structure, what's your plan for monitoring it? How are we going to be sure that this thing doesn't fall down? Which, when you do new things, especially with bridges, there's always that concern.
And just for those that haven't read about this or seen this in the past, there's some beautiful sort of videos of the making of online and everything. One of the interesting things is the artist that was working with MX3D, Joris Larman, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right.
Perfect.
Basically did a little dream, a vision of what he wanted, where it was put two robots on the side of a canal in the red light district of Amsterdam, push a button, and the robots would weave the bridge and kind of meet in the middle.
Yeah.
And if people were coming around then and they were doing graffiti, then it would maybe it would learn and weave that into the bridge. And the bigger aspiration you and I talked about and others was, what if you could have a robot that sat kind of under the viaduct and kind of they'd come up and fix the bridge occasionally.
Nick, we have a clip from one of the videos that you guys did that you guys put together early in the process. Let's take a look at that.
Nice. I forgot to mention that Peter likes to bring dead and sometimes inert guests onto the show. And so we've just had MX3D's Bridge visit our show.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of, it needs to show off. This is the first time we've had a thing. And maybe we'll have it back on when it's got some ideas of its own. So, okay, keep going, Alex.
Yeah. So there was this idea of let's put sensors on the bridge. Let's collect a lot of data when the bridge is in use. And this will give us a sense of how the thing is performing over time. And so MX3D agreed to this. And I went back to our sort of experimental lab on Pier 9 in San Francisco and got together with a group of people, and we said, well, let's figure out how to do this by using a bridge we already have here on the pier. And what you're seeing here is a picture of some IoT software, digital twin software that Autodesk has, which allows you to locate sensors on a structure and pull up data feeds from those sensors, so you can see how individual sensors are responding to the use of this bridge here, for example. So we sort of prototyped using this in San Francisco, and we set as a goal then to be able to have this bridge tell us how many people were on it at any point in time, right? So let's just get an occupancy count. This now is a picture back of the MX3D bridge, or a model of that, and you're seeing the sort of visualization that we're now capable of, which shows not just different sensors reacting, but also through the use of video cameras, we're able to see people on the bridge, and for anonymization purposes, we skeletonize those people, because we're really interested not really in the people, but we are interested in their footfalls and handfalls and movements on the bridge. But of course, we're not trying to identify anybody personally. So this is sort of what we set off to do. And here's a picture of where the bridge is actually going to go in the middle of Amsterdam. And of course, this is a very different environment than the occasional passerby in our offices. This is the middle of the red light district, and can get very, very, very crowded. And in fact, it's going in a spot where the city had already been doing verkeersonderzoeks studies, so traffic studies, because they're very concerned about crowd management. And this is the context there. Yeah.
Are we interested in football because we're interested in stresses on a structural thing or in people's behavior? What's the reason? Because often when you build a bridge, you know stresses ahead of time, but there's something about all of this real-time learning bridge stuff that makes it different.
Yeah, so the answer is both, and it depends on who you talk to. So for me personally, I am very interested in what is happening on and around the bridge, and what can the bridge tell us about that, right? I'm interested in this as a sort of sensor for the neighborhood. Most of the people involved in the project have come to it because they're material engineers or structural engineers, and they want to understand how can we, in a world full of aging bridges in particular, how can we use sensor data to better understand the performance of those bridges and whether they're getting into trouble. So, there are multiple people coming together with multiple interests on this, what is really a research project. And what's been so funny to me about this is, so I mentioned this started in 2016. The video you saw was from, I think, 2018. Here we are at the end of 2020, and the bridge is still not in place. And it's been...
What's there right now? This is a temporary bridge.
Well, at this very moment, there is nothing there, because this temporary bridge was removed in order to rebuild one of the walls of the canal. That's what that cofferdam here in the middle is. It's getting ready to pump out the water here so they can renew these canal walls.
Okay.
So that's what's happening here. But actually, when I took this picture, what I was trying to capture was the fact that people don't necessarily use bridges the way you think they do, right? You think bridge, well, that's how I get from one side to the other. But you look at this picture and you can see three separate groups of people who are just standing on the bridge. They're not going anywhere. And if you think back to that picture I showed you just a moment ago with these huge crowds, you realize, well, actually a bridge in the middle of this red light district, when it's crowded, it's really the best place to actually stand and see the red light district. It's one of the places you can get a picture of something other than the back of the head of the...
And this is a big tourist thing, right? So you've got people who want to stop and see this beautiful, like the canals and the two sides. It's a beautiful perspective view.
Yeah.
Excellent. Which is, of course, maybe your foot traffic assumptions about the weight of each person may be wrong if you just think they're going across the bridge. And
just your understanding of use cases and it's you engage with these things and you learn basically that most of what you assumed coming into it was mistaken or only partially true or something like that. The other reason I took this picture was to capture this camera up here in the upper right-hand corner. So there is already a couple of them actually, camera surveillance. This is a private one. This one belongs to the city and is used by fire and police to monitor the area. And in fact, the entire red light district is a fully monitored zone, similar to, let's say, the city center of London, where you should assume anytime, wherever you are in that district, you are in camera sight of cameras that are set there for that purpose by the city. But of course, during the time that the 4 years that we're doing this, cameras start appearing all over Amsterdam. Here's a busy intersection. So, they put a camera up here. They put a box with a computer down here. And there on the side, there's a sign which is sort of explaining to you for GDPR purposes that this is a camera and that it's taking your picture. So
there's a real question here. And I think Beth will probably be interested in exploring this too. Is like, what does it look like to give ambient consent? Like it's not a click through. Is it really a sign? So here it actually has a GDPR sign that you have to be like probably seen by the camera while you're walking up to it to go, yeah, by the way, we're looking at you.
Yeah, more than that. You got to get off your bike and you got to, sort of get down on the ground, and it's covered by,
dirt. Oh, it's down there at the bottom. Yeah. Okay.
But this is a pretty typical experience of sort of notice, at least, for these kinds of things, even in a European city as sensitive to privacy rights as Amsterdam quite famously and rightly is. So not a high bar to exceed. And then, of course, here we are, 2018, a lot of concerns about, or a lot of press about, China and the surveillance state and the use of social credit and all this. So there's an awful lot of concern about this. So in 2018, the bridge was complete. It had been fully printed, and we took it to Dutch Design Week, which is a big design festival in the Netherlands. And we put it out there, and for the first time it had a public run. And so what you're looking at is you're looking at the complete bridge here on the left. You're looking at the container in which we put all the computers and servers that are required to power it, and stood there explaining these things to the passerbys. And people were very interested in it. We also had these two cameras in place on these poles at either side, because again, we're using cameras as part of what we're doing here. And what we were explaining to people at the time was that the idea was that the cameras were going to capture what was happening on the bridge. And, another lesson, people do things on bridges you don't expect. They crawl up on the side. There are kids. There are, there's just when you put something in a city, you're immediately dealing with an incredible variety of behavior, no matter how.
By the way, I mean, you made me think of something. I grew up in Chicago, and there are the giant lions by the Art Institute. It's just an epic kind of art museum. And I just remember, you'd climb on the lion. Of course you would. You'd do things. And then when later I became an exhibition designer, an experience designer for physical places, I did some big international auto shows. And we did Ford, and we did like Audi and Volkswagen. And we wanted this crazy idea. We had an idea for Ford. It was going to be like the new logo, and there would be waterfall, past the logo, but it would go out in the waterfall to a pond inside the auto show in Detroit, the International Auto Show, to a pond that circulated through the entire, it was almost like a set of rivers and streams circulated through the entire Ford exhibition, which are like the size of cities because you have to have cars in them. And the first day that the design team walked up, we have press day. That's a very important day. Everyone's black tie, tuxedo. But the next day, it's open to the public. So it's kind of like pop-up city. And within about 3 hours, there was a little 7-year-old kid peeing into the stream. And we're like, perfect. Now the entire exhibition is going to smell like urine for the next 15 years. Because, they hold on to these exhibits. They put them in warehouses. It's like, how do you clean that? It's not, anyway. So this is the point, I think, though, that you're making, is people do weird things. Like, did you predict ahead of time they will lay on the bridge?
No.
Yeah. Fascinating.
No, and then the question.
And those cameras, by the way, your cameras were sort of Connect 3D cameras sort of thing. So they were looking at actual body wireframes of people or something. Is that correct?
No, the cameras actually are very low-fi.
Oh, really? Okay.
There's no LiDAR. There's nothing like
These
that.
are like off-the-shelf webcams.
It's off-the-shelf stuff. Yeah. And in fact, the ones on the pier were powered by Raspberry Pis, and it's pretty simple stuff. Yeah. What's complicated is the ML models that are able to turn those images or those films, basically the people moving in those little movies, into these stick figures, the skeletonization.
And when you say ML, you mean machine learning models?
Yeah. Yeah,
okay.
That's right. So we go and we're able to show people that as they move on the bridge is reacting, and this is the sort of feedback you get, and people really, really like it. It actually wins the public prize at the design festival. So, we come back very encouraged by that, and we have this idea, and we're talking about the potential for this. Imagine you have the bridge now, and this bridge is just one bridge in Amsterdam, but imagine that you find a way to get this same sort of information at scale for all of the bridges in Amsterdam, right? Ours is just going in here, but you could have a situation where all of the bridges are just telling you this one fact: how many people are on me at any moment in time.
How many bridges is that? It looks like 187.
Oh,
it's crazy. It's probably much more. This is just the city center.
Yeah,
so we're talking about, this is Amsterdam. Yeah. Perfect.
This is Amsterdam. A lot of bridges. And
why would you do that though? Why would you want to do that same kind of instrumentation on all the bridges?
Right. So my original, when I would give this sort of talk before, what I would say is, well, look, it's all about flow. Right? One of the bridges says, hey, I got nobody on me. Well, that's strange. Every other bridge has people on it. Oh, this is a drawbridge. Okay, great. That makes sense. And you start to see these possibilities to say, well, oh, that's interesting. So we'll actually be able to follow a ship through the city by watching bridges go, blank, go empty as the ship passes through and the bridges have to open for it. But really, you're probably more interested in the outliers that suggest, like down here, 134, whoa, 10 times as many people on this bridge as any other. Do we have a traffic backup? Is there some sort of issue? What's going on there? This needs attention. But the thing that I think got people most interested in was this ability to have a generalized heat map of movement of people through the city, and then an ability on the back of that to start to steer people, to influence where people went in the city. And it was at this point, talking about these at one of these events, that a proper data ethicist got up and said, you realize you are talking about manipulating people without their knowledge. It's not the same thing as me being in Google Maps and choosing my route.
What was the feedback manipulation mechanism? Once you saw what people were doing, what were you doing to steer them elsewhere?
Oh, we weren't actually doing anything. This is
what
all
might you have been doing that raised the question?
Conceptual, yeah.
Right, but you can imagine one of the things I proposed was, look, in the red light district, which is where the crowding issue is the most serious, people are there as tourists. They're not trying to go to any specific point in the red light district. So imagine that we played music at different points in the district, and if there were a lower density of crowds, we would play music in that space, and that would naturally tend to draw people over there. And there would just be these cues, maybe some that they weren't even terribly well aware of. For example, changes in the brightness of lighting or things like that.
And by the way, right, in one of our past episodes, Dr. Ting Jiang and others shared with us that upwards of 70% of our decisions every day are made by things outside of our brain.
Right.
Like the default checkbox for organ donation. We just don't like changing defaults. And we think we made the decision. We are more an ethical person than something else. But actually our cognition is not in all of our, it's only not our brain. It's actually the context. And the context shapes our decisions every day. And so you could really have been doing mind control, but not intentionally. I mean, you were like, oh, this would be cool. We can, and maybe I remember in an early brainstorm, we were talking about like maybe you could give a sensor or have like a cool instructable for a sensor that retailers right near the bridge could have. And they might be able to say, hey, you reduced my number of people coming to my store by putting that bridge there. Or you could learn about how to tear the bridge down and maybe have it weave itself, 2 blocks down, and it would actually help the retailers. So it was sort of utopian, aspirations about like how we might cohabitate or co-create with these bridges that might just up and leave if they, if they weren't needed.
Right.
So tell me then what happened though, because I think
is it utopian?
The story is sort of. Yeah.
Is it utopian or is it dystopian, right? And that's the thing. We tech types, we come at these problems as though they're these abstract problems of traffic flow and optimization of resource consumption. I think what this project has really helped me put foremost is there are certain absolutes about, human rights to agency, and those are not overridden. They cannot be ignored or subsumed by this drive to solve even quite serious problems of crowding, say, in the red light district, which is a real problem for the people who live there and for the people who want to see it. And it's a problem for the people who are responsible for safety in the city. But it's not an overriding problem that simply allows you to manipulate people without their awareness, right? That's really more of a dystopian than a utopian answer to that.
Now, this wasn't just you doing this with Autodesk or with MX3D. You teamed up with some other organizations, both in Europe, to think about this, to do the think about the machine learning part, to think about the other. Tell us a little bit about the partners and the evolution of that dialogue.
Yeah. So again, a research project. And so what happened was we ended up drawing into the project. They came in a variety of times. A group came in which brought in a couple of Dutch universities under the auspices of basically what is the funding from the equivalent of their NSF. The Turing Institute, which is the Data Science Machine Learning AI Institute for the UK, joined the project as well, and brought in a bunch of really quite amazing researchers and data science capabilities and funding, not least. And there's Autodesk Research, and there are a number of other contributing organizations. But the major research organizations that had an interest in this, what's quite interesting about them is they have very explicit data ethics standards, right? They have processes around ethical review, especially for research where humans are involved. And the bridge, pretty much by definition is going to have humans. That's what you're looking for. What happens when humans are on this thing, crawling, climbing, whatever they're doing. So it's been this very interesting conjunction where we've seen everything from sort of this very abstract, hey, we're tech guys from Silicon Valley and we can sort of do whatever we want to shape this completely protean world out there, to these very serious research organizations which say, we need to understand exactly what data is being collected and what type of notice is applied and whether consent is possible and so on before you can do a thing with this data. And that's been, I think, a very helpful influence in the whole project. It's really.
And I've seen some of your articles, but also some articles of design students working at different universities there that have actually started looking at what are the ethics and actually developing a set of principles for smart infrastructure, whatever you want to call it. I would tend to not call it smart infrastructure, but it's just like IoT is probably not the right word for what we're doing, but it's the catch-all. So I'd love to bring Beth on. Because Alec, you don't have any more to show. You want to just now explore this. Okay, great.
Enough pretty pictures.
So Beth, what's your reaction to kind of Alec's journey and kind of just stuff you might not have seen, because he gave a little bit more behind the scenes.
Oh, no, it's awesome. So I particularly like that Alec is treating the bridge as a sensor of the neighborhood. It's kind of like a mood organ of what's going on in the space. And that really just builds in terms of, so what is infrastructure? How is this working? I've got a short slideshow of nerd infrastructure love that the only reason I want to show a couple of images is because it just corresponds with some of the images that Alex showed.
I love it.
Peter, can I do it?
Yes, let's do it. Let's see. Have you?
If you do the screen share down at the bottom.
Yeah, you should hit your screen share, and then I'll pop the thing up.
Okay, let me see if it's just gonna. Is it gonna do my whole screen? I just want to get my
use an application
tab.
Yeah, you should be able to pick just that window.
All right, cool. Okay, good.
And then it'll put it in the green room, and then Peter will pull it up. There we go.
Here it is.
All right. So, I mean, this could be Amsterdam, but this is King Street in Toronto, and there was a whole digital infrastructure pilot that was, you recognize the 360 camera, that's a Bluetooth sniffer.
What are we looking at here, just so that I understand it? Can you zoom in a little bit more? Or is that not possible?
So we're looking at the top image, which shows a whole bunch of cameras and technology, and then
is it like a electrical utility pole or something, or
Yeah. So it's the crossing light on on the most trafficked street in the city of Toronto. And one of the reasons that I was interested in this was a parallel to Sidewalk Labs was grabbing all the attention, but the city of Toronto was installing this hardware that was taking images off the street. And the reason that they wanted the images is they wanted to sort out things moving in space. How quickly is the streetcar moving? How many people are moving? How many cars are moving? Cyclists, that was a little bit more complicated, but it all comes down to like sniffing MAC addresses, digitizing or just grabbing the images of.
Alec, you're nodding your head like, yep.
Yeah, I mean,
in what's going on here, if we're looking at people moving around, do they actually capture the images, or do they pre-process it so they're only capturing its people?
I know. So that's a perfect question. They're not quite the cute wireframe images that Alec's crew put together, but what the tech is supposed to do to preserve privacy is capture. The system learns to identify what is a car, what is a pedestrian, and what is a cyclist, and then in real time, it's supposed to translate the visual data into just, I don't know, whether it's JSON or CSV, but it's supposed to turn it into like data. So you don't have essentially surveillance cameras in the middle of the street. But, one of the problems is technology is not always, it's never perfect. So part of the stories that I've heard from both the city and from the company that made the tech is they then sent footage out to India and had human beings look at it so you could have threshold whether the system was doing it correctly. So, there's a whole complication there in terms of, the people in India, they're not humans because they're not in Toronto. You're like, what the heck?
They're not humans.
Right.
Beth, real quick, you're looking at your presenter mode, and I don't know if it's possible to just see full screen mode. You know how this is just part of the life of anybody trying to show anything on a screen. So if there happens to be a way to just switch
selected the wrong one.
You can just stop it, and Peter will bring it, just so that we can get the full image. It's just kind of fun to see.
Okay, I'm going to try it one more time, but it's also not that big a deal. Like, you got the point. Let's see if I can pick.
I have a question. Both of you showed these sensor arrays, and then and then there's this warning, which is which is kind of like the user consent agreement on Google or on Facebook.
Exactly, Peter. Exactly. And nobody reads it. Nobody can see it. This one is 10 feet up in the air. As Alec pointed out, you got to get off your bike in Amsterdam to read the ones that are 2 feet off the ground. So the idea of you've been warned is ridiculous.
Has anyone done an artwork where there's this thing and then kids can come up to it and then it discerns everything it's learning about you? So you can almost play with this game of how you're being observed? Because it strikes me that it's like, if you could actually see what it was learning and mess with it, people would be fascinated. And I don't know how else you accomplish literacy unless you give people the experience of seeing what they're seeing of them.
But that's where we need to go. We need to share the information. We need to make it enjoyable and playful, like the kids laying down on the bridge. We need to have more opportunity to play with this stuff. So it's not just this framework of surveillance. So some of this is just the data that's collected, and Alec can speak to this, but unless you're collecting it in a very clear way, it's just a mess. Like, it's just a muck of stuff.
That city thing from Toronto's capturing your Bluetooth? Like, I always think of Bluetooth as just between me and my phone and my tablet or something.
Oh,
but it looked like that was,
no.
Okay.
No, ask Alec. Alec, please speak to that.
Yeah, no, get your phone in a Faraday cage right away, Mick.
All right,
Exactly.
This jacket is actually woven with copper, and I have to plug it in. And then the ghost of Alan Turing shows up sometimes. We never know.
But the ghost plague, the ghost map, the copper is good against COVID.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So one of the things you just both reminded me of. So early on, in my fellowship at Autodesk, I went with the CTO then, Jeff Kowalski, just a brilliant dreamer, thinker, doer, guiding light for me. We went to a city meeting in San Francisco where some significant players in the networking space and significant players in the sensing space and the IoT space, early days, 4 years ago, like a lifetime ago. And they were talking about how they're working on selling the city, these cameras and these things and they're whatever. And I said to them, I mean, this was like a dinner table conversation, but it was a very, very high level and weird. And I was like, whoa, I just stumbled into this. And I said, so, you sound incredibly, coherent, and you're making some really important points. And I turned to the person on my left, and it was actually it was like the CIO of San Francisco. And I was like, so tell me a little bit about, what your perspective is. He's like, this is really, we're going to make this for the citizens. We actually are going to make them put in certain patches so that only certain stuff can be done and blah, blah, blah. I said, interesting. Okay. Guy from big network company that somebody could know. When he leaves and you guys do a patch, is there anything that actually stops you from just putting a patch that just gets rid of all that stuff that the CIO decided, because the next CIO's got some other opinion and or doesn't understand what he did, because he's actually pretty savvy. And the guy from this area is like, well, I mean, we might put it into our contract, but no, not really. I mean, we might just push an update. And I was like, interesting. That's not how infrastructure works. That is like treating things like, it's just very childish in some ways, but it's also in some ways, and I respected the people who were all at the table. It's frightening to have such laissez-faire kind of attitude, because they're like, well, I mean, by the time the next mayor or the next whatever's into, they'll probably rip this out and put something in. It's always beta, so you never know. And I'm like, no, actually, infrastructure is not beta. Right. Like, they did a big capital investment to put these sensors in. Yes, they will be old very fast, but the cost of doing another capital investment is not trivial. And some of these cities are struggling with their tax base and things like that. And so you might have to assume, just like Y2K bug was still around in 1999 because, of the inertia of old crufty software, the stuff you're doing now might have implications for your grandchildren.
I think more likely what happens is the sensors are abandoned.
Yeah. The Internet of bricked things.
Yeah.
They become bricks.
For one reason or another, I think of the San Rafael, the nearest city to where I live, is, all the street lamps are dotted with traffic sensors that are dead. They started this initiative and there wasn't the funding, or there wasn't success, or for whatever reason it stopped. And now there's just, nobody comes back. Nobody's going to pay to come and take that stuff down.
A long time back, I wrote an article with Autodesk about the IoT apocalypse. And actually, I think people in their homes are seeing this more than anyone else, because when Nest gets bought by somebody else and they go, never mind, we're deprecating it, suddenly you have a brick that you took apart your wall to put in, and it's a brick. It doesn't work. I've got Philips lights, but they used to be able to be controlled by Alexa in another room, but now they're Bluetooth, so that light has to be close to that light or else they fail. There's nobody treating infrastructure and complexity like it's going to have to be maintained by actual humans, like blue collar workers that put 220 volts in the wall and made sure that for 100 years people didn't shove a fork into it or get themselves hurt. We don't have, a building code for complexity. We don't. It's 50 years or 70 years into the internet revolution or the computing revolution.
And we certainly don't have one for data.
Yeah.
So, but Alec, I've got a question for you, or I guess for all three of you. Is infrastructure more nimble now? Is it more agile? Or we still are working with the historical paradigms of here's a cable, or here's a pipe, here's a bridge, here's a physical thing. So can you guys talk a little bit about, do we have greater kind of efficiency? Because that's something that is always part of the ML language, or
might they be more mutable over time or something? Like, is
it more mutable?
That's a fascinating question. Alec, what do you think?
I don't think so. I'm at what I hope is the tail end of this sort of two-part process, which has been very difficult in completely different ways, right? On the one hand, there's the challenge of placing a piece of infrastructure in the middle of this very old city, right? Where you're both faced with, who knows what pipes are there? Cast iron this and ancient that, and rebuild the brick wall, and so there's all of the material history of the place, and then there is the bureaucracy, the permitting processes, right, which are extensive, and especially for infrastructure, right? There's an awful lot to get through to get something placed, and in fact, the MX3D bridge, we managed to avoid much of that because it's technically an art project.
Oh,
so there was some latitude. It's actually only supposed to be there for a couple of years, so it's permitted for a couple of years. But at the opposite extreme, we have, or not the other side of this, is that it's a data collecting object for which there is no permit process. Right. So there's this. We want to put up cameras. We want to collect data. We want that data to go someplace. We want to be able to do analysis on that data. We have lots of internal controls on what we can do about that. We are certainly cognizant of GDPR and paying attention to that and doing everything we can to be responsive to that. But the process for knowing whether or not you have met whatever tests might exist for the digital life of this artifact and for the physical life of it could not possibly be further apart from each other.
So this is the problem, is almost a mismatch between old and new, and the pace layer. If you think of pace layer thinking, the pace layer of a mayfly is one day, its entire life. The pace layer of chewing gum is like maybe the wrapper is a few weeks, maybe, or a month. The pace layer of plastic things, well, we pulled them out as dead dinosaurs, and they're going to last for about 20 million years in the form of like a big island floating out in the ocean of plastic. And so the question is this mismatch of pace layers. But I actually like where Beth is going with this too. I mean, if we were to flip our picture and say, let's dream a little bit. If we embrace the bioeconomy, if we embraced the way nature works, where there's no such thing as waste, it's feedstock for the next thing. You have permaculture. What would a permaculture for infrastructure look like, where you rotate crops just like you might rotate infrastructure? And this bridge does tear itself down, and actually it's more valuable to be used as some other thing. I recently saw someone leasing a wall to a major building because the glass was not going to be efficient in 5 years, or the aluminum would actually be more valuable in other things, so that they would continually update it. So you basically didn't buy the side of your building, you bought a service contract for the side of your building that then would continually try to reach some performance metrics that would then get people paid. Now that's scary too, but what happens if we actually, I'll stay to the side, what happens if we embrace this sort of idea of permaculture, but for infrastructure, where you rotate crops, or you let them lay fallow? Could we rotate bridges? Could we let buildings lay fallow? Could we allow nature to come back? And what would policies look like for that? What would the code look like for that? How, because this mismatch is not going away just because atoms are not necessarily entirely mutable like this. I don't know. Thoughts? Is that?
I don't like it.
You don't like it? All
I don't
right.
like it. And I'll tell you why. When I was living in Amsterdam at various points in this project, and at one point I was living in the west part of the city, and a bridge across the main river in the city was closed for repairs. And who I saw, where I shopped, what I did for entertainment, everything changed. It was, really the impact, it changed my social circle. It had this incredible effect. And I think infrastructure kind of belongs in this class of man-made objects that have such a deep influence on how everything else gets built around them, that there's something very wrenching the idea that one day a bridge is here and the next day it's going to be someplace else. Like, no, I have enough in my life that's variable.
I mean, it's an interesting question of what
So
portions
Mick, he
of our
just laid
city.
down where it is what it is. That's what I'm hearing. Where it is what it is.
You're right.
Peter, what were you saying?
Well, I was going to say there are other portions of our cities that we want to make more flexible and programmable. For example, after COVID, when the whole concept of how are downtowns used, or suddenly very quickly we move away from office space, but yet we want to bring artists back. There's a flexibility to zoning and playing with space, or the adaptive reuse of space, that seems more urgent now than it's been, or we want to drive experimentation. And I'm wondering, Beth, a little bit, you were alluding to this earlier, it was tantalizing, what you've been seeing recently, because you connected the collective experience of going through sidewalk, becoming literate to what we're looking for in cities, together with COVID, which has essentially sped up trends that were going on and changed use patterns. So kind of what's some of the stuff that you're seeing and some of the responses that can be applied?
I'm still resonating on Alex's love of cities being visible and findable and trackable,
and
but
stable.
within that, and stable, but within that, we also all are hearkening to Calvino's Invisible Cities, where the infrastructure might have stability, but the paths through can continually change and grow and are poetic and meaningful. And also Amsterdam is a city of water. And it's also a city historically of stoners who get lost AF just going through these canals. I lived on the Newmark when I was an artist in resident at the Vach. So I was living in the red light district. Like, I'm feeling you on this in terms of the tourism, the often yuckiness of people showing up as tourists, but also the increasing economic dependency of Amsterdam on tourism and the real kind of conflicted feelings about that. So to go back to Peter's inquiry about, so what happens here? Because so much attention, like Sidewalk Labs, it was almost a comedy, because there was just so many words spent over this project. Pages and pages of proposals, newspaper articles, people protesting on Twitter, people protesting with their placards in the street. And unfortunately, and this is not a popular opinion because it's a mixed opinion, it was a missed opportunity. So yes, I feel like Sidewalk Labs obviously needed to handle it much better. And the basic argument from activists that a private company cannot come in and run a city, that's what the city should do, that's clear and we understand it. But at the same time, who builds the infrastructure for cities? In New York City, public Wi-Fi is provided by a contract to Sidewalk Labs. That is literally who's built the Wi-Fi platforms that provide free and public Wi-Fi in the city of New York. And that's its own 15-year subcontract. It's, X thousands of machines across 5 boroughs, and built into that third-party, contract, which is standard. Cities, that's what cities do. Cities aren't experts on building the IoT hardware. There are all kinds of questions in terms of, if you sign up, where's that information going? Is it tracking you? Because, I signed an NDA, but I don't know if it matters anymore. But when I talk to these people, they're just like, so we're going to be able to push advertising at people more or less as they walk by, because we're able to take up that much information.
Yeah.
So I understand that they were shockingly not, they had so much design language, Mick, it was sick. They literally, all the Post-its, all they were learning from you, but people called, they called foul. There's no, we don't understand any there. We don't have any sense of trust. Yeah. So it really came down to, there was not sufficient trust. But Peter, this idea of what's possible with this technology is exciting. And yet we couldn't find a good way to kind of meet in terms of how can we experiment with this. And I love that what Alex said is, this is essentially an artist project. So you can slip it in under the radar because it's art. And that in some ways is a kind of a promissory. That's something around trust. I don't know, maybe I got that wrong.
Well, it does lower the barriers in the sense that, look, this is not a permanent change in your neighborhood. This is something we're doing.
We're experimenting.
Yeah.
Well, and I think actually,
by the way, we have a wonderful example of that in San Francisco. If you've seen the Bay Lights, which is this wonderful art project that's put 20,000 LEDs on the bridge, when the concept, when it was conceived of, and we had a meeting to launch it, and we actually had Mayor Newsom there, Willie Brown, and Ed Lee. And someone said to the three mayors, well, if this is good, don't we want to keep it around? And they're like, oh, no. This is just temporary. We'd never want this to stick around. It's just a project, because they knew the minute you said it was going to be permanent, every agency would put the kibosh on it. And that's how it came in, and then people fell into it. And there's a corollary to the story. Mickey knows.
And by the way, for people that are not in San Francisco, yes. I mean, the Bay Lights are there right now. And in fact, that art project was so beloved by the city that that they raised enough money to tear it all down and actually put real permanent connectors and do a better job of it. The interesting thing, though, is I think the artist who developed it is the only one who has control over the playlist.
This is correct. So
is that Leo's piece?
It's Leo Villarreal's piece, and
yeah,
and you know, so there's several nuances here, because that is a piece of very visible and programmable infrastructure that lots of people loved and were engaged in. Right. So one of the lessons here was how you slip it in. Mm-hmm. Another lesson had to do with data, in that, you know, he could have done it as a visualization about the city. And he steadfastly refused, because his artistic belief was he was interested in kind of fractal and flocking systems, the kind of art and code you'd use in a game to make waves or whatever. And so his entire thing was he was using that kind of code, and he'd just sit in a hotel and put stuff out. And if he saw something that he liked, it would be a generative thing, but he'd see a clip that he'd like, and he'd build a playlist. And that's how he came around with that. Other artists like Rafiki Anderal has actually built pieces here that have been based on city data, and are try to get people to start to play with what the data of a city is about. By the other pieces, you know, we did art pieces that were temporary urban interventions here in our urban prototyping and our Market Street prototyping project, where we, and Mick, you know this, but we, as San Francisco, thought through what would be the future of Market Street, which is not famous for people dwelling on it, or does not feel like the East Village. It feels like take the bus. So we allowed artists to build these temporary things. We suppressed the city planning rules so that you could not worry about the code and a bunch of stuff, and then we instrumented the heck out of it. It was so successful, we wanted to do more experiments. So we got Mayor Lee we passed the Living Innovation Zone legislation. We gave ourselves legislative permission to do more of these. And what happened? Immediately when that happened, every department said, well, if it looks like art, we're in charge. We're the Arts Commission. And the utilities people got in, and the whole thing died, because we wanted to create a permanent form of impermanence, and you can't do that.
Mick, you got muted somehow.
Probably it's wise that we get muted. By the way, it's around 5 o'clock West Coast time, and if anyone has to leave, we're now into overtime. But if you can stay for a little bit, it'd be wonderful. I think, Peter, though, too, when I saw Prototype Market and, you know, gray area, the thing you founded, and Autodesk and others helped support it, it was this kind of takeover from the ferry building at the water all the way to like public housing, or all the way to the, you know, to the Tenderloin or the City Hall. And it was fascinating to watch that by suspending the API to the city that the policymakers were doing just for like a few days.
Yeah.
It was around the citizens being able to, and in many ways to the artists, being able to push around and play around with what the API was for their own city. And, you know, I remember seeing like a ping pong game that was on 4 corners of Market Street, where a homeless person was kind of like whacking the ball this way. It was digital. And then like tourists were on the other street corner, so they were plenty far away and they felt fine. And some tech bros were on some other street and they were playing like 4-way ping pong. And I was like, okay, that's just weird. Like, but a fascinating experiment. But you also had these little micro parklets, which in a sense pushed San Francisco to think about micro parklets, which today actually we're taking advantage of with all the outside. If you've got a restaurant, you know, there's now a very well defined way that you can have a parklet outside, or if you've got a store, you can take over a few of these. So I do think that there's this, how do we have the bottom up experimentation and joy of citizens and people on the edges of that, the artists and others, pushing around on what could be. But we also have maybe how do we make stability something that you can trust in a city? Like, we're not going to pull the rug out from under you. Like, you bought that car. When you go down to the garage tonight, we're not going to change out the shag rug in the car for something else because we decided to push an update. You know, like, you bought that car. That's what you wanted. And I think, and I use that as an example because I'm a car nut, but it would really piss me off if like Tesla's update changed the car to some other car. But that's what would happen if these atoms and bits get together. And I'd like to have some stability, or choose and have choice. Where do we go from here?
I've got 2 questions for Alec. Alec, did people ever get to see in real time robots building the bridge? And my other question is, can you come to Toronto, and then we'll go to Barcelona and some other places, and build one of the collective thinking spaces that Mick has really helped to refine? So we can have people in essentially a place that gets made in real time, working in real time. And in this case, it can truly be temporary. So we can make it out of sugar or salt, and then it will just dissolve. So those are my 2 questions.
So I've got really good answers to both of them. So first of all, the idea that robots with MIG welders, which will blind you if you watch them working, could ever be building things in public was really never that was not going to happen.
No, okay.
So no, people can't watch these robots work, and it's actually one of the kind of, I think, very interesting things about robots, and also about this project. One of the benefits to Autodesk of this project is that a lot of our customers are very interested in dark factories. And which is to say, on factories which there are no humans, therefore there don't need to be any lights. And yet we need to know what's going on inside those factories. And can you censor a space such that you have this feedback of the sort, you get that sort of X-ray view that the bridge provides of what's happening on around it. You can turn the space into a giant sensor of its own environment. But no, you can't look at robots while they're doing MIG welding. Bad idea. On the Toronto question, better than me going there, which of course at the moment is impossible, is the fact that pretty much everybody else who's worked on this project is in Toronto. Autodesk Research is based in Toronto. Alex Tessier, who is the key technical mastermind who's made all this happen in a technical sense, is a research scientist at our Toronto offices over in the Mars building, and I'm sure we'd be delighted to meet with you. We also have, I think he's in Montreal, David Benjamin, who is the guy behind the design lab, The Living, which is it's been a while now since they've done this, but I think they continue to work with biological substances. He was or at any rate, the design lab was the one behind building out of mycelium, that structure in the courtyard of that museum in New York.
PS1, yeah.
PS1, exactly. So I think everybody you could possibly want to talk to at Autodesk.
And The Living, by the way, David Benjamin's architectural studio was actually acquired by Autodesk a number of years ago because the office of the CTO wanted real architects to be pushing the bleeding edge of what the future was, and that's why you could tap into that. So yeah, Beth, you should totally. I think this would be delightful, and I'm sure we can help you get connected. I think Alec can help you get connected. Absolutely. I wanted to show something, Peter, if I can share screen. Can you pull up my share screen for a second? Okay, so and tell me what you see, because I'm going to hit the play button. Do you see just a full black
Yep.
We see Wynton Marsalis quote.
Okay, great. So actually, I like this quote because it actually inspires me a lot about, it's from his biography, about this notion of could we play jazz? And let me read it to you first, and then I'll explain what I mean with infrastructure. I had something to say, and so did they. He's talking about the other bandmates that he might do a pickup game, pickup quartet with at a jazz club. The freer they were, the freer I could be, and vice versa. But to be heard demanded that we also listen to one another closely. And to sound good, we had to trust one another. And when you read it, it's a wonderful book, but when you read it, he talks about how he might show up as a trumpeter for a pickup gig, and he doesn't know the drummer. He doesn't know the bass player. But they basically all know that they should play the A train to get going. In that way, he can see, does the drummer know what he's doing, or the bass player, oh my gosh, he has practiced the A train. He has practiced this classic of jazz. And then there's always a time when you get to do a solo. And, the bass player, the trumpeter, the other instruments might just go off into some crazy new space, but you had to listen because you were the trumpeter and you wanted to go wherever they were going. You wanted to explore that space. So you had to listen to them very carefully. It was a very improvisational kind of approach. And you might go home at that night and go, wow, okay, that guy was crazy. That Miles Davis guy I just met, he just went off into some weird space some universe that I want to explore. But it might be that it chews at you and you think, oh man, I'd love to explore that. And I think that's kind of how artists, but also how cities and societies evolve, is we've got people that push us out, but we have to listen to them. And what happens when the infrastructure actually starts doing a little bit of jazz, starts doing something interesting during a solo, that we're like, actually that could be an interesting thing for us to do. So that's my setup. And then I'm going to show a short film made by one of our researchers with her daughters, where there was this new thing that came out, and you've probably seen it. It was a few years ago, where it was an AI system that was very naive. And her daughter, she's a human scientist and human-centered researcher, Erin Bradner. Alec, you know her well, and she's amazing, genius, and her team. And she basically brought her kids in and she basically had them play with this AI. And the AI was a game. And the secret of the game was this research group at Google wanted to figure out how pictures worked, how kids saw pictures, how humans saw pictures, try to train the AI as a young child AI about what a picture of a phone was versus a picture of a chair or something. But it was a game where you actually played, and I actually found it to be fascinating, and it made me think about what would happen if that bridge, or what would happen if something else, a little bit along the lines of what you showed, Alec, with the kids laying on the bridge. What if you could be more of a give and take, but in a safe place? I mean, psychological safety, but also show off how dumb the AI is and how smart the kids are. So let's play this. Can you guys hear the audio?
No.
I'll stop for a second. Can you hear the audio of the kids talking?
No. And there's also a band across the kids' faces in there. Maybe that's intentional.
That's intentional, yeah. So hold on. I think there's probably something I have to do to stop that from playing.
You're muted again, Mick.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Perfect. I'm optimistic, my friends. Okay, so now I'm going to hit play again.
Let's draw. So we have to draw a church. Okay, church. Looks like
I see bench, or stairs, or hexagon, or pillow, or pickup truck. I see police car, or car. I see ambulance, or shoe.
Come on. Shoe.
I see bulldozer.
It's not a church. That's a mission. Okay.
Sorry, I couldn't get it.
Okay, I'll stop here. Did you end up hearing their voices this time?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the kids are being given a challenge to draw something, and then the AI is trying to guess it as fast as they can. So that's the AI writing those little things and talking. So let's watch the rest of it.
Tiger? Oh, a tiger.
I
That's
see necklace, or garden hose, or bread, or beard. I see pool, or vase, or potato. I see alarm clock, or calendar, or toothpaste, or cat.
Stripes.
I see cooler, or raccoon, or bee, or marker. Oh, I know, it's tiger.
oh,
Oh, got that one right.
a postcard.
I see elbow, or foot, or pillow, or suitcase, or pool. I see diving board, or shoe, or bread, or calculator. I see map. I see hot dog.
That's my postcard.
Or pizza.
Come on.
That's a postcard.
I see steak, or toothpaste, or marker.
The AI is hungry.
I
Yeah.
can't get it.
A helmet.
It didn't get a postcard. Okay, draw a
I see
helmet.
rainbow, or squiggle, or bread, or cookie. Oh, I know, it's helmet.
It's very excited when it knows.
Yeah, what's the stereo? It's like a radio.
What's a stereo? The kids say.
I see bench, or diving board, or pillow, or suitcase. I see radio, or television.
That looks
I'm
like a
not sure
TV.
what that is. I see oven.
That looks more like a TV. Maybe if I add one there.
I see washing machine.
Another one there.
Or sink. Sorry, I couldn't get it.
Square's pretty easy.
I see bench, or nail. Oh, I know, it's square.
Guess 3 out of 6. The ones that it missed were church. I think that's a pretty good church.
Well, that's a good one.
Yeah, that one's really good.
Can I try drawing more?
And a postcard that it missed a postcard. Those look just like mine.
Mhm.
Somebody put an envelope with a postcard. Just for some envelope.
Yeah.
Yeah, people.
And then a stereo it also missed. Okay.
Oh, a stereo.
It's like a boombox thing.
Boombox thing. Maybe.
Now, I'll stop there. Peter, you can stop sharing the screen. What I found fascinating about that, and delightful in some ways, was that you could actually hear the kids learning. They were like, oh, what's a stereo? Oh, it's a boombox. Okay. Or, hey, that's a postcard. That's what it looks like. You're an idiot, AI. And it was kind of playful and fun. And of course, secretly, it was teaching the AI. If a lot of kids drew this thing, it was teaching the AI thing. But it actually had a kind of a playful approach to it, right? The AI was like, oh, I know, it's this, you know, and it didn't make the AI like some godlike genius. It was like, this thing doesn't even know what a postcard is. Like, I'm not worried about AI, you know? And that's because today, at least, there are no AI systems that have innateness or common sense or a mental model or anything. There are $100, $200 million, you know, prizes by DARPA and the Paul Allen Institute and others for anything that has common sense reasoning. So we know that's actually pretty far away, but, you know, kids, totally common sense, no problem.
So I don't know if you remember this, Mickey, but the way, and I skipped over this in my explanation because I didn't know how much time I had, but there are cameras on the bridge which are watching these skeletons and seeing them going on and off the bridge. The real reason those cameras are there, right now, the cameras are what allow the bridge to know how many people are on it. It's what allows it to give that occupancy count. But the idea is that over time, the AI system on the bridge will learn to be able to correlate those numbers with the sensations it's getting from the rest of the sensors. So the fact that it deflects this much from strain, or that it tilts this much in its inclinometers, or that it's measuring these footfalls with its accelerometers, it should be able to, at a certain point, give you an accurate count of how many people are on it without the cameras in place. And the analogy that I've used to explain this functionality is to ask people, do you have a sibling? And do you remember when you were young and you used to draw letters on each other's back and have to guess what that
Oh yeah. That's
what we're trying to teach the bridge. And it's I don't know how closely it actually is, you know, in terms of mental model, it actually, if you could break open the AI and really understand it, but it's really the same kind of thing.
I like that.
That is awesome. I have to go.
I think we're Beth. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you two both end up talking a little bit more about doing something up in Toronto. Thank you, Beth. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, you guys.
Bye bye.
Hey, Alex, I have a question, or Mick, when it comes to one of the most interesting kind of data infrastructure things going on right now is how we're using mobile data to understand people's movements during COVID and how that can then be processed to tell us what places are risky. So you may have seen a piece in Nature a couple of weeks ago where Stanford and a bunch of scientists took mobile data in the US from 81 million people, but it was 3 billion data points. And they were able to resolve it to who was going to a restaurant or who was going to a bar or who was going to a gym. And then based on where those people lived and how much their infection rates were, they were able to predict with incredible accuracy what was risky behavior or not, right down to if you went to this restaurant in this zip code and it was this many people, the likelihood someone was infected. So one, I thought this was the most astonishing act of data science I'd seen in a long time. And it was a powerful kind of ad hoc piece of infrastructure, which, if properly used, could in fact change behavior. But it wasn't really displayed. It's not like you could see that data, play with that data. It's not like you could walk into a part of town and things were shining how risky it was. There was no feedback. And I was struck that somewhere between either an art project or some way of sharing that, there's something that's both could change behavior, is educational, but also would create an enormous amount of data literacy, just because here's this enormous national problem for which there's completely good insight into behavior, but we have behavior change problems. So it's more of a behavioral economics problem. But Alec, you were thinking about how to change behavior with sensing.
Yeah. So one of the really big challenges that we've had with the bridge, it turns out much more than people being sensitive to its data collection or any insights that it's going to gain, is the simple presence of this alien object in the red light district. People are worried it's going to increase the number of tourists to the district.
It is.
So we're talking in a neutral sense about, we'll help you measure how many there are and maybe help you solve crowding problems.
The fact that the bridge was cool and interesting was going to mess with the system.
Exactly. In itself, it was a problem. So the idea that we would have a light show on the bridge, or the bridge would give data feedback, or that it would be a playful object.
How is the bridge boring? Yeah.
No, the bridge is already too interesting. Don't tart it up anymore. And where this really came home was in our original design for notice, for a board on the bridge that would give notice and explain what was doing. Well, anything of any size, people are going to stop and read, which means you're going to increase your crowding and traffic issues around the bridge. So no, please do not place a sign on the bridge. So we've got this very difficult tension between the desire to be low profile about stuff, and yet to give people proper notice about what the capabilities of this thing are. We started with a lot of these ideas of, the bridge will, it'll show people their footfalls, or it'll notice that somebody's in a rush by their pattern of motion, and it will illuminate an open path across the bridge to allow people to move more quickly through that. And I actually used to live in that neighborhood, and I had a dream about how when I was biking home with a beer crate on the front of my bike about to crash and lose 20 bottles of beer, the bridge would recognize this and would clear a way for me and allow me to sort of sail effortlessly.
Right.
No, they don't want any of that.
But I wonder, the shock of the new, if that was the only bridge, instead of every bridge, every place you go to in Amsterdam, it's just the way it is. So I wonder if it's kind of like a novelty curve. Like if this were to actually become pretty common, and I think the other part, would that not be the same case? But I actually think the core idea that sometimes it needs to be a little bit more subtle or just fade into the background because it's just supposed to be a piece of infrastructure. But maybe sometimes it could primp, it could be a peacock. It could show off its feathers, it could do things. Is an interesting question. And then I think there's the other part, which is, in nature, you've got all these different pace layers of time. You don't see trees taking over the forest and fighting battles with other trees. You don't see, but if you put a stop motion camera in there, you actually do see all that stuff. It's like crazy town. It's like survival of the fittest out there in the forest, and so I wonder too, if the bridge were to be on a pace layer that a robot did actually sweep across it and actually weld things in a covered little containment unit, from the viaduct over. But it was more like a sloth. Like you wouldn't notice it unless you actually happen to be like a retailer or somebody that was there that just sat out on the porch all day long. Would that have been something? And I don't often see people play enough with time as a design element, and I wonder about that.
Yeah. Or, we also had this idea at one point where we would give the bridge a personality of a shy person. And so the bridge would do these interactive things, but it wouldn't do it when there were many people around. And so there was this lovely idea that, the bridge would do something really cool. And you'd be like, oh my God, and you'd run and you'd get your friends and you'd come back to the bridge, you'd try and get to do it again. It was embarrassed, It was
so do you remember when I was a kid, and this, Peter, you're at least 100 years older than me, so you might have seen this, but you might have been like, in your 50s at the time. But when I was a kid, there was Chuck Avery or Chuck Jones? Chuck Jones and Tex Avery were the most amazing animators of Bugs Bunny and Looney Tunes. And there was this beautiful Looney Tune that I'm sure I saw it 4 million times when I was a kid, where this building is being erected, and in the cornerstone of the building, somebody who's a worker, they're knocking down the old building, and they get down to the cornerstone foundation, and they find a box, and they open the box, and there's a frog in the box, and the frog jumps out on the box and starts singing, well, I love you, mammy. And it starts doing like a whole show with a tuxedo and all that. And when someone else walks over to the frog, it sits back down and just ribbit. And you're like, and he's trying to show it. He's trying to turn this into a thing. And the end of the cartoon is basically him putting it back into the cornerstone of the year 2050 building, like, okay. And maybe I don't even know where I went, but this is overtime. But I think this idea of like shy, or what's the personality of a bridge, certainly, and we might have talked about this in the past, but the Alexa, I talked to one of the designers. Oops, it just woke up. I talked to one of the designers of that thing over there, and they said when we first built it, we said, what is natural in the house? What is natural in the house that actually has skills or tricks? So what is natural in a household that can do tricks? Alec?
Dog.
Kids? A dog?
I don't, but sure.
I mean, at certain ages. A dog, exactly right. So they actually designed their user experience based on a dog. And I went and met somebody who had an Alexa the first year. And it was sitting over in their living room, but they could talk to it in the kitchen and stuff. And I said, Ray, did you know that this was and he's a designer, amazing designer. And I said, did you know that this was the UX of a dog? And he goes, what are you talking about? It's the most futuristic thing ever. And he has dogs. And I said, watch this. And I called the device by name. It starts with an A, and I won't say it this time because I'm worried. And suddenly the LED at the top of the device swung around and looked at me. And then I said, Ray, say its name. And Ray said it, and it swung around and looked at him. That's exactly what a dog does when you call its attention. You're like, Fido, and it's like, huh? And you're like, no, Fido, over here, Fido. And then you ask it to do a trick. Alexa, turn off the floor lamp. Just turn off the floor lamp. And it can only know a certain number of tricks. The Alexa can only understand about 100. And so they decided to teach it tricks, but also make it dumb like a dog in some dimensions and really smart in others. So when it doesn't understand something, it looks at you like, I don't have any idea. The LED goes back and forth like, huh? And so that was very interesting because we co-evolved with dogs over about 30,000 years. 30,000 years ago, we were living in caves trying to domesticate dogs. And so we co-evolved together. And so they picked that as a personality. Now today, you might not feel that because probably that original design team is long gone and they've evolved it a million ways. but it wasn't trying to be the all-knowing, powerful Siri. It wasn't trying to be the smartest ass, Einstein in the world.
Genie in the bottle, yeah.
Yeah, it was trying to be something you already know, because they wanted trust early on. I just thought, how might we teach designers, teach engineers, teach policymakers, teach product developers to actually be a little more sensitive to these other aspects of the experience.
Yep. Yeah, and yet our primary interface is a flat screen, poking a flat screen, for which I can't think of any analog in nature. And we keep taking, buttons and levers and things that do make good sort of intuitive, instinctual sense to us, and doing away with them and putting them in a phone. It's just like,
oh yeah, I mean, some phones you can't pick up without them, like literally melting down and freaking out, because they're like, "What? You just touched me? I'm going to show you some. Whoa! You touched the side of me? Oh my gosh!" It's like the most hyperactive, abused animal or something like that.
Yeah, they're all rescue terriers. Yeah,
they're all rescue terriers. Yeah, or I used to have greyhounds, and you had to spend 2 or 3 months fostering them so they understood not to walk through a glass door, or how to walk up a pair of stairs, because they've been on the track, unfortunately. And, Peter, any last words? Any last thoughts? Alec, any last thoughts? We're coming up on 5:30. A little past 5:30.
No, thank you. I mean, a real pleasure. Real pleasure. This is fun. It's actually more fun to do than it is to watch.
Well, I'm actually curious, how close is it to possibly being installed? I thought, like, literally this month it was going to be put in.
So it should have already gone live. And what happened was we had somebody in the team installing it come down with COVID.
Oh my God.
That knocked out the whole team.
Really?
Well, they commute together.
They had to be
now everybody's
right? Yeah.
And then we had a last minute, not exactly a permit issue because we've got the permit, but at any rate, a last minute issue with the city wanting to do kind of a 13th hour check on another part of the canal wall yet again. So we're just wrestling with these things, and I'm just waiting to go with the champagne. But
what's your expectation timing?
I really hope it will be. I'm going to say February.
Okay,
I think what I think is conservative and say February.
Yeah, excellent. Peter, it looks like you've got something as a last word. I saw you playing around with. So for those of you who've just joined us, Peter used to be at this place called Apple. I don't know if you've heard of it. It was named after an 1800s brand created by a guy named Macintosh up in Canada, where he and his sons figured out how to do something called cloning and grafting. And they found this really tasty apple in their orchard, and they bit into it, and they're like, that's a really good apple. And when they tried to just plant the seeds, it didn't turn out the same at all. But when they cloned it, so every Macintosh apple is actually a clone of the original one found in that orchard. That was such a powerful brand, co-created with nature, and a guy named Macintosh, that when this weird company called Apple came about, they actually stole it from them. So Peter, what do you're from that?
Well, Mick, we've talked so much about improvisation and jazz in our cities, right? We've talked about the fact that cities adapt and have to change. And weren't you using kind of a jazz analogy earlier when you were talking about cities?
Yeah. Wynton Marsalis and how do we play and improvise? Yeah.
Which is exactly why tonight's special guest joining us here for the end of quarantine and to take us into the weekend, ladies and gentlemen, Wynton Marsalis.
Oh.
The real power of jazz and the innovation of jazz is that a group of people can come together and create art, improvised art, and can negotiate their agendas with each other. And that negotiation is the art. Like you'll hear all the time when Bach improvised, and he did improvise, but he wasn't gonna look at the second viola and say, okay, let's play Ein Feisty Berg. They were not gonna do that. Whereas in jazz, I could get together. I could go to Milwaukee tomorrow, and it'd be 3 musicians. I walk in a bar at 2:30 in the morning and say, "What you want to play, man? Let's play some blues." Well, all 4 of us are gonna start playing, and I might say, "Do-do-do-lee, do," and they'll say, "Bo, bo, ba-do, ba-do-do-lee, ba-do, pra-pa, do-do, bo, ba-dee-lee, ba-do-lee, do, ba-do-do-lee, ba-do, do, do, Everybody will just start comping and playing and listening, and the bass. You never know what they're gonna do. So that's our art. The 4 of us can now have a dialogue. We can have a conversation. We can speak to each other in the language of music.
Oh man, that was perfect.
And the reason we brought this up is what we may be forgetting right now and want to recapture is that a great city is a jazz city. It is that connection and that jazz of people who are out in public and come together and create something great. I mean, New York City, which had African Americans streaming in and Eastern Europeans streaming in and all of this fusion of culture, that's really what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. And we sometimes forget it when we're all at home and on Zoom. But that's why I thought it would be great for Wynton to take us out.
Nice.
And we'll save Apple for the next time.
All right. Thank you, Alec, for joining us.
Thank you both so much.
Out in the ether. Thank you, MX3D Bridge, for joining us. We'd like to see what happens when you wake up. And thank you, Wynton Marsalis and Peter.
And we'll be back next Wednesday and next Friday. Oh, by the way, next Friday, we should point out, is the Quarantine Christmas Party.
Oh, yeah.
The Quarantine Christmas Party will be a spectacular. It's going to be an evening of memories, ephemera, and urban films with our friend Rick Prelinger. Rick has famously done Lost Landscapes. He brings together every year for the last 20 years clips, home movie clips, World's Fair clips, transit company clips of cities. And so we're going to review some of this stuff, but also these ephemeral films that we make, which could be the visions of World's Fairs going into the future or corporate propaganda. They are a snapshot of us kind of as we have been throughout cities. So that's going to be our, bring out the popcorn spectacular.
And his archive is insane. I mean, it's huge. I remember having a CD-ROM of the Prelinger archive back in the early days of computers when they had things called CD-ROMs. So he's actually going to be joining us and sharing some of these.
Rick will be with us. And by the way, this is what's so great about it. Rick will be with us on Friday. The following week will be his big annual showing of Lost Landscapes. Usually it's a sold-out event at the Castro Theater. This year has to be virtual.
With a live organist, I remember.
Yeah, and the audience providing the soundtrack because people would remember it was their street and their story.
So Rick, I think that was where my dad lived. Yeah, because these are ephemera from 100 years ago, more.
So Rick will be previewing that with us. And we have another show in the works for next week that we're still working on. And we'll see you next week. Thank you so much, Alec, Vicky. And now the Quarantine song.
What time is it, by the way?
Oh, it's 5:40 Pacific Quarantine.
Let's get close, but not so